The sound hit first. A deep, mechanical growl, metal grinding against dirt, coming from the edge of my land. When I pulled up, I saw it, a bulldozer idling 10 feet from my cabin, yellow caution tape flapping in the wind, and a group of men in hard hats standing like they were waiting for permission to erase history. My history. A woman in a blazer turned toward me, clipboard in hand, voice sharp and confident. "This structure is scheduled for demolition," she said. "It's unsafe. And it doesn't belong to you anymore." I laughed at first. I thought it was a mistake. That cabin had stood there for 135 years. Built by my great-grandfather with his own hands. It survived floods, fires, wars, and generations of time. And now an HOA, formed less than a decade ago, was claiming it was an abandoned shack. Neighbors stood watching. Phones out. No one spoke. The woman stepped closer and lowered her voice. "You disappeared. The land was reclaimed." Then she gave the crew a signal and said the words that made my chest go cold. "Start prepping. He has 10 minutes. They thought time erased ownership. They thought silence meant surrender. What they didn't know was that I had something they never bothered to check. Stories like this remind us that power only works when people stay silent. If you believe history, truth, and ownership still matter, drop your city or state in the comments so we know where you're watching from. And if justice over intimidation matters to you, like, subscribe, and stay with this channel. That cabin wasn't just wood and nails. It was a living timeline. My great-grandfather built it in the late 1800s, long before paved roads, zoning boards, or homeowners associations even existed in this area. Back then, the land was raw, trees, dirt, and silence. He hauled timber by hand, cut each beam himself, and raised the walls one season at a time. Every generation after him added something small but meaningful. A new porch. Reinforced beams. A stone fireplace that still holds warmth like memory. I grew up there during summers. Learned how to split wood on the side of that cabin. Heard family stories by lantern light when storms knocked out the power. Birthdays. Funerals. Quiet mornings where the world felt untouched. When the property passed to me, the deed was clean and unquestioned. Taxes paid. Boundaries surveyed. No disputes. No complaints. Just land that had existed peacefully for more than a century. Years later, a new development popped up down the road, neat houses, identical mailboxes, and eventually an HOA. Their sign stopped well short of my fence line. Or so I thought. I had to leave for a while. Family came first. I checked on the cabin whenever I could, kept everything maintained, never abandoned it. But absence has a way of inviting assumptions. And somewhere during that time, someone decided history only mattered if it was convenient. I didn't know it yet, but my silence had been mistaken for surrender. The first letter arrived 6 months after I left. It wasn't aggressive. Not yet. Just a clean envelope with the HOA logo stamped neatly in the corner, like it belonged there. Inside was a courtesy notice, informing me that a structure on their property appeared to be in violation of newly adopted safety standards. No photos. No measurements. Just a polite suggestion that I'd address the issue promptly. I assumed it was a mistake. I replied the same day, calm, professional, attached copies of my tax records and the survey map showing my land sat outside their boundary. I expected a correction. Maybe an apology. Instead, the next letter arrived with a fine. Then another. And another. Each one escalated in tone. What began as courtesy turned into noncompliance. They cited cracked beams, unstable roofing, fire hazards, claims that didn't match reality. The cabin was old, yes, but it was solid. Inspected. Maintained. Loved. I asked for a hearing. They scheduled one, without notifying me. By the time I learned about it, the HOA board had already voted unanimously. According to their meeting notes, the structure was now deemed unsafe and abandoned. The recommended solution, removal. I drove back that weekend and found bright orange notices stapled to my door. Condemned, they read, as if a word printed in bold could erase 135 years of standing proof. That's when I met her, the HOA president. She was confident in a way that didn't invite discussion. Perfect posture. Practiced smile. She spoke like someone used to being obeyed. When I explained, slowly, that the cabin wasn't under HOA authority, she tilted her head and smiled. "You weren't here," she said. "You didn't object in time." I told her ownership doesn't expire with absence. She disagreed. According to her, the land had been absorbed into the community for uniform safety enforcement. She claimed precedent. Claimed legal review. Claimed the board had done its homework. When I asked for documentation, she waved her hand. "That's handled internally." The fines continued. Late fees added. Interest stacked. The numbers were absurd, thousands for violations that didn't exist. When I refused to pay, the language shifted again. Now it was about public safety. She warned me about liability. About lawsuits if someone got hurt. About the community's right to protect its image. She spoke like she was doing me a favor. Then came the final notice. Demolition scheduled. No court order. No judge. No inspection beyond their own clipboard. Just a date, a time, and a warning that resistance would be considered obstruction. I called the county. They said it was a civil issue. I called a lawyer. He asked one question. "Do you have the original deed?" I told him yes. "Then don't panic," he said. "But be there." 2 days later, I pulled into my land and saw the tape, the machinery, and the neighbors watching like spectators at a verdict that had already been decided. That's when I realized this wasn't about safety. It was about power, and they were testing how far they could push it. The moment I stepped out of my truck, every conversation stopped. The demolition crew leaned against their equipment, arms crossed, waiting. A sheriff's cruiser sat off to the side, not there to stop anything, just there to make sure no one got loud. Neighbors lined the road in quiet clusters, pretending to scroll while recording everything. The HOA president stood front and center, sunglasses on, clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge of authority. "You're late," she said, glancing at her watch. I told her to stop the demolition. She didn't even look back at the crew. That decision was made weeks ago. I asked her, calmly, to show me the legal authority giving her the right to destroy a privately owned, historic structure. She smiled. Not nervous. Not rushed. Smug. "You had your chance to contest this," she said. "You chose not to be involved." I felt something tighten in my chest. I told her I was never notified properly. That the hearing was held without me. That I had records proving the cabin was never part of the HOA. She turned slightly so the neighbors could hear. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that concerns us. Emotional. Uncooperative." Then she raised her voice. "This structure has been declared unsafe. It is a danger to the community. And frankly," she paused, letting the silence work for her, "it doesn't meet our standards." That word. Our. I pointed to the cabin behind her. The uneven porch steps. The weathered wood. The hand-cut beams that had held up through a century of storms. That place stood before your neighborhood even existed. She shrugged. Old doesn't mean important. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Most stayed quiet. I asked the sheriff to intervene. He stepped forward slowly, careful with his words. "Sir, this appears to be a civil dispute. I'm only here to keep the peace. So you'll just watch?" I asked. He didn't answer. The HOA president gave a subtle nod to the crew chief. He reached for his radio. My heart started pounding. I told them I'd filed objections. That I had proof. That they were making a mistake they couldn't undo. She leaned in close enough that only I could hear her. "You left," she said softly. "You didn't protect it. Now we are." Then she stepped back and raised her voice again. "We've already delayed this long enough. Begin preparations." The crew started measuring. Stakes went into the ground. Tape was tightened. Each movement felt like a countdown. I tried one last time, explaining the history, the family legacy, the fact that this cabin had survived longer than anyone standing there. She cut me off mid-sentence. "Sentiment doesn't override policy." That's when the neighbors started whispering. Not in my favor. Words like abandoned, eyesore, liability floated through the air. People who had waved at me for years suddenly looked away. Silence turned into judgment. The HOA president saw it and pressed harder. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "this is about safety and progress. We can't let outdated structures hold us back. Progress." I looked at the cabin one more time. The door my grandfather had carved. The beam with initials scratched into it 100 years ago. I felt anger, but underneath it, something worse. Helplessness. She checked her watch again. 5 minutes. I stood there, surrounded, outnumbered, publicly stripped of authority over my own land. They had documents, uniforms, confidence. And all I had, apparently, was a story no one wanted to hear. I lowered my voice. "Give me 2 minutes." She laughed. "For what? A miracle?" I didn't answer. I turned and walked back to my truck, slowly, deliberately, feeling eyes burn into my back. Behind me, the engine of the bulldozer revved slightly, like a threat. They thought I was retreating. They thought I was done. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't walking away. I was walking toward the one thing they never bothered to check. I opened the truck door and reached behind the seat. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the noise fade, the murmurs, the idling engine, the quiet confidence of people who thought the ending was already written. My hands didn't shake. They were steady in a way they hadn't been all morning. I pulled out an old leather folder. Not new. Not polished. The edges were worn soft, the kind of wear that only comes from decades of careful handling. Inside were documents my family had protected longer than any structure on that land. When I turned back around, the HOA president smirked. "Oh good," she said loudly. "Paperwork theater." A few neighbors chuckled. I walked straight past her and stopped in front of the sheriff. "I need you to look at this," I said, calm and clear. He hesitated, then took the folder. The moment he saw the first page, his posture changed. It wasn't dramatic, just subtle. A pause. A longer look. His thumb stopped tapping the edge of the paper. The HOA president noticed. "What is that?" she asked sharply. The sheriff didn't answer her. He flipped the page. The county seal was unmistakable, embossed, faded, but official. Dates handwritten in ink. Signatures from a time when the land didn't have street names, only coordinates. I spoke for the first time in minutes. "That's the original deed. Filed 135 years ago. Recorded with the county before zoning, before development, before your HOA ever existed." She stepped forward. "That doesn't mean anything. Our attorney." The sheriff raised a hand. "Ma'am. Please." Silence fell hard. He read more carefully now. The legal description was precise. Metes and bounds. Exclusions clearly marked. One sentence, underlined in red ink decades ago, stood out like a loaded weapon. "This parcel is exempt from future communal governance unless voluntarily annexed by the owner." The sheriff exhaled slowly. He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the county clerk," he said. The HOA president's confidence cracked for the first time. "There's no need for that," she said quickly. "We've already." The sheriff had already turned away. The call took less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes that felt like an hour. The bulldozer shut off. Workers stopped moving. Neighbors leaned closer, phones forgotten. When the sheriff hung up, he faced her. "This property is not under HOA jurisdiction," he said. "It never was." Her mouth opened. Closed. "The deed is valid," he continued. "The structure is legally protected. Any attempt to demolish it would be unlawful." Someone whispered, "Oh." The HOA president recovered fast, too fast. "This is absurd," she snapped. "We acted in good faith. We were told." "You were told wrong," the sheriff said. "And you should have verified before taking action." She turned on me. "You deliberately withheld this." I met her eyes. "You never asked." The neighbors murmured now, not whispers, but confusion. Doubt. A few people stepped back, like distance could separate them from what was happening. She tried one last angle. "The structure is still unsafe," she insisted. "Historic or not, it's a liability." Right on cue, a county vehicle pulled onto the dirt road. An inspector stepped out. Clipboard. Badge. No nonsense. He introduced himself, reviewed the documents, and walked the perimeter of the cabin slowly. He knocked on beams. Checked the foundation. Took his time. Then he turned to the HOA president. "There is no condemnation order on this property," he said. "No inspection request filed. No authority granted." Her face drained of color. "In fact," he added, "your board has no standing here at all." The inspector issued a cease and desist on the spot. The demolition crew began packing up without being told. The sheriff handed me back the folder. "You might want to keep this close," he said quietly. "And consider filing a complaint." The HOA president stood frozen, surrounded by people who were no longer sure she was in charge. I spoke one final line, soft, but loud enough for everyone. "You tried to erase 135 years of history without reading one page." No one laughed this time. The power had shifted, and everyone felt it. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence was heavy, the kind that only follows a sudden collapse of authority. The bulldozer sat lifeless, engine cold, like an accusation. The yellow tape fluttered uselessly in the breeze. The HOA president was the first to break. "This isn't over," she said, but the words landed flat. There was no audience left for them. The county inspector ignored her and began writing. Each scratch of his pen felt louder than the machinery ever had. He explained the violations clearly, methodically: unlawful enforcement, harassment, unauthorized demolition attempt, misuse of safety codes. Every point stacked against her like a record she couldn't erase. The sheriff stepped closer to her. "Ma'am, I'm advising you to step away from the property." Her voice rose. "You can't just undo months of board decisions because of one old document." The inspector looked up. "History doesn't expire," he said. "Authority has limits." Neighbors were no longer pretending not to watch. Some looked embarrassed. Others angry, but not at me. A few people whispered apologies under their breath. The demolition crew loaded their equipment in silence. No drama. No confrontation. Just quiet retreat. The HOA board members, who had stood confidently beside her earlier, began to distance themselves. One stepped back. Another answered a phone call and walked away. Leadership evaporated in real time. She turned to them, desperate now. "We acted together," she said. "You approved this." No one answered. The inspector handed her a copy of the cease and desist and informed her that the county would be opening a formal review into the HOA's enforcement practices. Fines were likely. Sanctions possible. That was when her composure finally cracked. "This was supposed to make things cleaner," she said, voice shaking. "Better. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to." You tried to fix a problem that wasn't yours to touch. The sheriff approached me. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. We should have stopped this sooner. I nodded. Not in triumph, just acknowledgement. When everyone began to leave, I stayed. I walked up the porch steps slowly. Each creak felt familiar. Honest. I placed my hand against the outer wall, feeling the grain of wood shaped by hands long gone. This cabin had survived winters that buried it in snow. Fires that swept the valley. Years when the world changed faster than anyone expected. It survived today, too. Behind me, the HOA president stood alone, staring at the structure she failed to destroy. No clipboard. No audience. Just consequences. As I stepped inside, the door closed with the same solid sound it had made for more than a century. The line had been crossed. And then, just as quietly, it had been drawn back. In the weeks that followed, the noise faded. The county's review moved quickly. The HOA was formally warned, fined, and stripped of any claim over my land. Their authority stopped exactly where it always should have, at the edge of history they never bothered to respect. The cabin was officially recognized as a protected historic structure. Repairs were approved. Preservation grants offered. For the first time in years, the future felt secure. Some neighbors came by to apologize. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Power has a way of reshaping memory. As for the HOA president, she resigned before the review concluded. No announcement. No farewell. Just gone, like her certainty had been. I spent that first night back in the cabin listening to the quiet. No engines. No threats. Just wind through the trees and the steady presence of walls that had endured far worse than intimidation. They tried to erase 135 years with a clipboard and a deadline. All it took to stop them was the truth, written down, preserved, and finally read. Because real ownership isn't about control. It's about history, responsibility, and knowing when something was never yours to take.